Question just came in on the following. John, I'm looking for some real world interpretation of what types of equipment and situations 409.70 of the National Electrical Code would apply to. All right, so let's take a look at that one. 409.70 is in Article 409 Industrial Control Panels, and 409.70 is surge protection requirements. I'm going to answer this based upon the 2023 edition of the National Electrical Code right off the bat. And I do want to say, remember, anything I say is my interpretation, which means nothing. Your AHJ, authority having jurisdiction, is the ruling factor. I'll give you my opinion on this, and that's all it is my opinion. All right, so let's take a look. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to navigate this question to help you understand my thought process. So, the first step, in my opinion, is to understand the scope of Article 409, because any piece of equipment that I'm looking at, I need to make a determination on what areas and sections and requirements of the National Electrical Code do I need to follow. That journey begins with understanding the equipment and understanding the scope of the article. So, Article 409 covers industrial control panels. 409.1 is the scope. Now, this tells us what Article 409 applies to. So it's very important and relevant to this question, because the person who's asking the question is saying what equipment in what situations would I need to provide surge requirements, surge solutions for an industrial control panel. So what we would first look at is the scope. The scope of 409.1, or Article 409, the scope of Article 409 is industrial control panels intended for general use and operating at 1,000 volts or less. So we know we have a voltage and we know we have industrial control panels, but we have to understand, what is an industrial control panel? Well, we do know that it's 1,000 volts or less, and that's AC or DC. It doesn't say AC only or anything like that. The requirements of Article 409 apply to 1,000 volts or less, industrial control panels, AC or DC. Now, there's a reference, ANSI UL 508A, standard for industrial control panels. That's a very important piece of information, because if I'm looking at a piece of equipment and I look for a listing mark and it's listed to UL 508A, I know immediately I'm in Article 409. Let's take a look at the UL standards around 508. If I journey into the standards library, I find that there's a UL 508 standard for industrial control equipment, a ULC 508 standard for rating and fire testing, fire extinguishers, etc. UL 508A is the standard for industrial control panels. That's the one that we are most interested in. 508B is relays used in IT equipment. 508E is your type 2 coordination for short circuit testing. And then 508I is your disconnect switches intended for use in PV systems. So 508A, that's the key that's immediately going to tell me anything that is listed to UL 508A falls under the requirements of Article 409. Okay? Now, Article 409 does not have a requirement that industrial control panels shall be listed. You'll find a listing requirement, for example, in Article 422 for appliances. All appliances must be listed. So we know that if you have an appliance, it's got to be listed. Number one, if it's not listed, you're not going to get approved. If it is listed, you're following all the rules in 422. 409 isn't as clear, because there's no requirement that says all industrial control panels shall be listed. Now, because there is not that clarity, we need to understand what the definition of an industrial control panel is. We go to Article 100 for that information. Article 100 tells us that an industrial control panel is an assembly of two or more components consisting of one of the following: either A power control components only, such as motor controllers, overload relays, fuse disconnect switches, and circuit breakers. 2, control circuit components only, such as push buttons, pilot lights, selector switches, timers, switches, and control relays. 3 is a combination of power and control circuit components, and the components with associated wiring and terminals are mounted on or contained within an enclosure or mounted on a subpanel. Now, there is an informational note that tells you that the industrial control panel does not include the equipment that's being controlled. It's that enclosure that has any one or more of the following in this list. Now, what that does is that opens up the door that if you have a piece of equipment that's not listed to something, and you threw a couple indicating lights, a little starter in there, a contactor, and a push button, or 2 push buttons, you now have an industrial control panel. Even though it's not listed as an industrial control panel, you still have an industrial control panel. That piece of equipment would have to follow all of the requirements in Article 409. Once you deem it to be an industrial control panel, you're into the requirements of 409, not just 409.70, but all of the requirements of 409. If you have an enclosure that's listed, say, to UL 67 or some other standard, or UL 98, switch, whatever, then it would not be an industrial control panel. It would be that other subject, which it's listed to. So the listing is very critical in helping us understand where in the code I need to go for the requirements. If it's listed as an appliance and it has push buttons, it has switches, it has timers, but it's listed as an appliance, that's Article 422. I'm following Article 422, not 409. If I have a product that's not listed with any one or more of these, two or more of these components, then it is an industrial control panel. Make sense? All right. Now, that gets us into Article 409. Once we know we're in Article 409, let's take a look at the requirements of 409.70. And you've got to parse this out and look at every aspect to completely get when you need to apply a surge protective device on an industrial control panel. The first gate that you need to pass is that it is a part of a safety circuit for personnel protection. Now, what does that mean? That means, I would argue, if you have indicating lights telling you something is on or off, remember, this is my opinion. I'm not the AHJ. You're going to have this discussion. If you don't want to apply surge, the easy route is that if it's a industrial control panel, either it's listed to 508A or it meets the definition. If you put surge protection in there, you're done. There's no reason for anybody to reject that installation. If you elect not to, you're going to have to explain why it's not part of a safety circuit for personnel protection. I would argue if you have indicating lights, if you have any buttons on there that turn something on or off, it's a part of a safety circuit for personnel protection because establishing an electrically safe working condition will be dependent upon your piece of equipment. The indication of whether a piece of equipment or a process is on or off will be dependent upon that industrial control panel if you have indicating lights. So don't just think about there's no GFCI, there's no AFCI, so I don't have a safety personnel protection. If it's a part of a process, if you're relying on this equipment for any reason, whether it be absent to understand something is turned on or off, or use that equipment to turn something on or off, to establish an electrically safe working condition, to lock and tag out, whatever it is, if there's any components in there that are starting and stopping a motor, have any overload protection, short circuit protection, those are all components, those are all safety features important for personnel protection. You would have to have that discussion with the AHJ if you don't want to put surge to explain why your industrial control panel does not provide a safety, is not a part of a safety circuit for personnel protection. The second gate is subject to damage from surge events. Now, if you have components, you don't have any electronics, you could probably make an argument that there is no way a surge could possibly damage any of the components within my industrial control panel. Hence, it is not subject to damage from surge events, even if they exist. Or you could go to the route to say, look, no surges are even possible in my power distribution system. Either way, you need to be able to provide evidence to the AHJ on why you feel you are not subject to damage from surge events. And then once you pass those two gates, that's sort of the gatekeeper to the last portion of this sentence that says surge protection has to be provided and installed within or immediately adjacent to the control panel. Now, immediately adjacent doesn't mean you just take a surge device, mount it on the wall, don't wire it up and say it's there. It has to be a part of the circuit, okay? So the surge protection is either going to be in that equipment or as close to the bus as possible. Because remember, when it comes to surge, we want short lead lengths. Every inch of lead length lets more voltage through. Now, there's no performance criterias in here that says the lead length has to be a certain length. We do have requirements that tells you as short as possible. But to get to what an actual lead length maximum could be or should be is a complex scenario. So following manufacturer's rules and understanding surge, getting it as close as possible to the equipment and the components that you're trying to provide protection for is most critical. But that's the requirements. So 409.70, you didn't get here unless you either have listed UL 508A equipment or you meet the definition of the defined term industrial control panel. Once you're in Article 409, in addition to everything else in 409 for that piece of equipment, you're going to have to meet the requirements of 409.70. You're either going to provide surge, just put it on and be done with it, or show that it's not subject to damage from surge events, or show that it's not a part of a safety circuit for personnel protection. That would be a discussion between you and the AHJ. My opinion on that matter doesn't matter.
Yeah.
The AHJ's opinion does. Hopefully, this helped you understand 409.70 and the application of 409.70 and gave you some insight on how we navigated, even determine whether or not your piece of equipment needs to follow the requirements in Article 409. Thanks for watching.